I'm calling my sermon this morning, A Town Stirred by Pride. And I'm offering it as a reflection at the end of Pride Month. And as Pride Month is about community, I am going to be weaving together several stories and resources and people who I have been following, hopefully to create a tapestry with meaning. And I'm going to start with a sort of invitation or caution to us as allies. We can often think that kindness and niceness are what people need, but they're not indicators of love. They're tools of white supremacy and means of oppressing marginalized communities. To put it a little differently, peace is not about the absence of war and conflict. Peace is justice and equality where provisions of life are met. And families are not always havens of safety, especially when it comes to the LGBTQ community. And this is why you might often hear of the LGBTQ community talking of chosen family, although it's not exclusive to the LGBTQ community. Family can be a place of harm and suffering, and chosen family can be the balm and the healing. With those two invitations and cautions, I think it's important to provide a reminder of the history of Pride. Often we overlook during Pride that the LGBTQ community is a community with broad intersections that includes Black people, Indigenous people, and people of color, people with disabilities, people with substance use history, the elderly and the young, immigrants and emigrants, people from literally every part of life. And it's important to note that Pride's history is a history of protest and riot in opposition to the police, and that it was initially led by women of color and trans women of color. And I say this because there's, I think, every year conversation around Pride of whether police should be at Pride and who should be leading Pride and what Pride should look like and whether Pride is about assimilation and being comfortable or whether it's about being true to yourself and saying you're welcome to be here, but your comfort is not assured. So I just learned about the Compton's cafeteria riot. This was before I was born. Actually, Stonewall was also before I was born. So I would love to hear afterwards about those of you who lived through these moments, what you remember of them. So Compton's cafeteria riot in August of 1966, there were trans women and drag queens who rioted in response to harassment from the police at Compton's cafeteria because the employees would regularly call the police to have the LGBTQ community escorted out of the cafeteria. And on this particular day, a drag queen threw coffee in a police officer's face when he tried to grab her. And this led to tables being flipped, thrown cutlery, and police officers being hit by purses. And even people outside of the cafeteria fought back, destroying a cop car and setting a newsstand on fire. So that was 1966, and then in 1969, the Stonewall Uprising took place. Stonewall Inn was a gay club known to welcome all of the LGBTQ plus community, including drag queens and runaway or homeless LGBTQ youth. which kind of gets at my caution that family is not always a safe haven, and in the LGBTQ community, chosen family is where you find that safety. So early on June 28th in 1969, police raided the Stonewall Inn and arrested 13 people. A police officer hit Storm Delavier in the head with his baton, which, depending on the story, is sort of what started the riot. Other stories will say that I think it's Marsha P. Johnson threw a brick. Probably both of those events contributed. But the rioting started. Hundreds of people gathered to throw bricks, bottles, rocks at the club and the police, and the Stonewall Inn was set on fire, and riots continued for 6 days. And this is where one of the pieces of LGBTQ history can be whitewashed. And two of the main leaders during these riots were Marsha P. Johnson, a Black trans woman, a sex worker, a drag performer, and an advocate for trans and homeless people and youth, who was 23 at the time and a later co-founder of STAR, which is the Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, with Sylvia Rivera. And Sylvia Rivera, who is a Latina trans woman raised by her grandmother, who beat her for her feminine expression, and by 11 ran away from home and became a sex worker near Times Square. And at the time of the Stonewall riots was 17, a founder of the Gay Liberation Front, co-founder of STAR with Marsha P. Johnson, an advocate for gay liberation movement to be more inclusive of marginalized members of the LGBTQ plus community, such as people of color, transgender people, poor and homeless people, and incarcerated people who I had not mentioned before. So that's a little history and background, some of which is more well-known, some of it less well-known, and sort of leads to the question of, that was in 1966 and 1969, what does that mean for us today in 2023, and what do allies do, what do members of the community do? So for allies, there's a hope for inclusion to be the answer. And I think there's a big hope in inclusion. But we sometimes get a little confused about what inclusion means. So a third caution or invitation is to keep in mind that inclusion does not mean welcoming everybody, regardless of what they believe and how they act. Specifically, you don't welcome people who are doing harm to others, especially those doing harm to communities who are not safe in many places. That does not mean that everybody gets to be comfortable. People with power and privilege can and should expect that they will not be comfortable at all times. So while I was preparing for this message, a name kept coming up, Karl Popper, who was a 1940s philosopher. And I really do not know much about him, except that several of the people who I trust and who I'm going to link stories into mentioned him. And he proposed this paradox of tolerance. He states, if everyone is tolerant of every idea, then intolerant ideas will emerge. Tolerant people will tolerate this intolerance, and the intolerant people will not tolerate the tolerant people. It's a little hard to wrap your head around, so I'll read it at least one more time, maybe two. If everyone is tolerant of every idea, then intolerant ideas will emerge. Tolerant people will tolerate this intolerance, and the intolerant people will not tolerate the tolerant people. Should I read it one more time? I'll read it one more time. If everyone is tolerant of every idea, then intolerant ideas will emerge. Tolerant people will tolerate this intolerance, and the intolerant people will not tolerate the tolerant people. So basically, if you take inclusion as your singular goal, by including everybody, even those with harmful ideas, the harmful ideas are the ideas that become dominant. And then the inclusion is not inclusive because the harmful ideas are the ones that have gained power. So now we're going to get into several of the stories and the people who I want to introduce you to. The first is a story that I found on Twitter by a user named IamRageSparkle. There is a little bit of language in this, but I chose not to censor it, so please forgive me. I was at a shitty crust punk bar once, getting an after-work beer. One of those shitholes where the bartenders clearly hate you. So the bartender and I were ignoring one another when someone sits next to me, and the bartender immediately says, "No, get out." And the dude next to me says, "Hey, I'm not doing anything. I'm a paying customer." And the bartender reaches under the counter for a bat or something and says, "Out, now." And the dude leaves, kind of yelling, and he was dressed in a punk uniform, I noticed. Anyway, I asked what that was about, and the bartender was like, "You didn't see his vest, but it was all Nazi shit, iron crosses and stuff. You get to recognize them." And I was like, "Oh, okay." And he continues, "You have to nip it in the bud immediately. These guys come in, and it's always a nice, polite one, and you serve them because you don't want to cause a scene, and then they become a regular, and after a while they bring a friend, and that dude's cool too, and then they bring friends, and the friends bring friends, and they stop being cool. And then you realize, oh shit, this is a Nazi bar now. And it's too late because they're entrenched. And if you try and kick them out, they cause a problem. So you have to shut them down. And I was like, oh, shit. And he said, yeah, you have to ignore their reasonable arguments because their end goal is to be terrible, awful people. And then he went back to ignoring me. But I haven't forgotten that at all. There's a Black disabled disability activist who I follow. Her name she goes by Crutches and Spice. Her name is Imani Barbarin. And she talks about what's called the Overton window. The Overton window is this way of thinking about what's politically acceptable to a majority of people at any given time. So moving that window is the goal or the objective of the culture wars. Her description of this says that someone saying something that's particularly violent doesn't necessarily think that it's going to happen. Their goal is to get it into the public thought. They're moving that window so that that violence becomes closer to being acceptable. So she gives an analogy. She says if someone tries to say the sky is blue, Reverse that. If someone tries to say the sky is green, and you're like, obviously the sky is blue, that argument puts green, the sky being green, on equal footing with the idea that the sky is blue. So then the middle ground, the compromise, becomes that the sky is blue-green. But the sky is blue. So compromising and saying that the sky is blue-green already moves the idea that the sky is green closer to acceptability. It moves this Overton window of what is politically acceptable closer to what they're arguing for, just by the nature of engaging in an argument with them about it. Another person I follow goes by the name of Watchful Coyote, Jack, and he did a video called Healthy Masculine Protectiveness. And he's relating a story of a Nazi coming to town with a sign. He says, "What are you going to do in this situation? What are you going to do now if a Nazi comes to your town, to your neighborhood with a sign?" Jack says that Nazi rhetoric, Nazi thought, Nazi presence must be actively excluded from public space. He's not saying that conversation and compassion can't happen, but those are things that happen in private, one-on-one, not in public spaces. He doesn't refer to the Overton window, he does refer to Karl Popper. But his point is that if you engage in compassionate conversation with Nazi thought in public spaces, that gives it the space to move that Overton window in favor of Nazi thought. Even if we're not all the way, it's moving it slowly. So Jack took what sounds like a fairly extreme stance. Jack made a sign that says, "The only good Nazi is a dead Nazi." And he went to the corner that the Nazi was standing on, stood in front of him, and made it clear that he was not welcome, that Jack was going to protect this town and keep it safe. He shouted and was aggressive and said, "We want you dead and gone." He escalated with the Nazi. He wanted the Nazi to feel threatened, excluded, and shut out of the town. And he says there were other people there. There were people crying and processing. There were Jewish people, people of color, and women. And Jack highlights that there are diversities of responses and that all of the responses are necessary to overcome the hateful rhetoric. And Jack says his role was to get the Nazi out, screaming and threatening until he left in his car. And Jack said afterwards he walked back to the corner, and the people crying, who could not exert the same privilege that Jack had as a white man, asked Jack, "Where are the rest of you?" Where are the rest of you? Violet Stanza, a trans woman TikToker, shared about her experience this year. She said, "I never thought I'd be scared for Pride Month, but here we are." She escaped from a man who tried to assault her on the street. She said, not for the first time. She said, normally I'd be excited for this time of year. I'd be planning outfits and figuring out what events I wanted to go to. But this year, there's overwhelming anti-trans hate in the country. She's nervous about the spotlight of Pride Month, creating an excuse for people to be bigoted. Naming the threat that the Proud Boys made to ramp up their activity. Naming the way that Target pulled Pride merch due to the backlash. And pointing to trans women who were used in an attack ad by President Trump. She says this is her third Pride out as a trans feminine person. And in the past 2 years, she did not have to worry about her safety and the safety of her friends in the same way that she did this year. So this is my final section. Hopefully, I will be able to kind of pull back in the story of Ruth and pull in a few messages of hope. Anna Bladel, who is one of the co-directors of In Flesh, wrote in their reflection this week, wonderful newsletter. If you sign up for it, I encourage you. They said, queer liberation theologian Marcella Althaus-Reed invites us to make theology indecent, to, quote, do theology without underwear, end quote. To remember that our sexual stories are sacred stories, and that the longing for a lover's touch, the longing for a sacred connection, and the longing for liberation share more in common than not. They say this year, this Pride, I'm missing the marches, the collective movements of enfleshment that root me in lineage, that reminds me and regrounds me in ancestral courage, creativity, resistance, defiance, joy, revolutionary love. I am missing less the parades that can feel performative, detached from radical roots, abolitionist dreams, flamboyant queerness, insistent holy indecency. But hear me, loud and proud and yet alive, queerness saves my soul. Transness enlivens my spirit. I love these forces of feral freedom, of delightful divergence, of persistent, transgressive pleasure. But hear me, loud and proud and yet alive, queerness saves my soul, transness enlivens my spirits. I love these forces of feral freedom, of delightful divergence, of persistent, transgressive pleasure. And in Ruth, we see many of the echoes of both the harm and pain that the LGBTQ community faces, but also opportunities for hope and chosen family. Ruth experiences the loss. Mara experiences the loss of family, loss of safety, loss of security. And there probably were people who could have offered her safety, food, and shelter. But the law upheld the lack, the fear, the instability that she experienced. Despite that law and the out that Naomi gave her, Ruth chooses Naomi, despite those challenges. And Naomi, later called Mara, says, God's hand is against them. A feeling not unfamiliar to the LGBTQ community. And a feeling that many churches and many Christians would be happy to support. But then Ruth responds in an incarnate, embodied faith and says, I am with you. Your people are my people. Your God is my God. I will die where you die. Death will not separate us. Chosen family creates places of safety, places of connection. Chosen family echoes the steadfastness, the loyalty that God offers to God's people. All of this resulting in a town, the town of Bethlehem, being stirred when Ruth and Naomi, also called Mara, returned to town. Now, it doesn't actually say what stirred the town up. I would imagine it's that these two women chose not to be beat down by the lack and the loss of safety and the loss of security, and instead chose one another and traveled back to town where they could hope that things would be different and they could be loved for themselves. And I think it's interesting that Naomi claims for herself a new name, a name of Mara, claiming that she has been, that God's hand has been turned against her. And there's not really any notice of how the people in Bethlehem respond to that name change, other than to say they don't use it because she's still referred to Naomi. But Mara and Ruth came back to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. And I think that might be perhaps the most hopeful statement in the passage, because it's just a part of life. They came back during a season, a time of the year that happens every year, and it'll happen again next year, and it'll happen again the year after that. And they will be at home in Bethlehem. And I hope one day everybody, the entire LGBTQ plus community is able to come home and have it not be of note, but to have the story told that they came home after college, or they came home during the summer, or they came home at Christmas, to find love. And safety. Amen.